Hi, I'm Don Shaw, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 27 of Friending the Mirror. My guest today is Dr. Linda Wachs, and I'm really excited to have her here because she's talking about something that is obviously very close to me in my life, and that is facial paralysis. Let me tell you a little bit about this episode, which is called Adjusting to Acquired Facial Paralysis. Dr. Faye Wachs didn't think much about facial paralysis until she experienced it for herself. She was surprised at how little was known about both the causes and consequences, so she developed her own study. Dr. is currently a professor of sociology at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. Over the last 8 months, she has interviewed over 100 people with facial paralysis, seeking to gain a better understanding of, among other things, the effects of facial paralysis on self-esteem, outside influences, including family and peer support, access to resources, their career, social standing, and how the absence of facial expression affects social and professional life. Dr. Wachs's published work focuses on gender equality, health, fitness, media, sport, sexuality, and consumerism. A book that she co-authored called Body Panic, Gender, Health, and the Selling of Fitness received the North American Society for Sports Sociology Distinguished Book Award in 2010. Aside from facial paralysis, her research also focuses on youth, race, and social media, and best practices in education. In her spare time, Dr. Wachs enjoys hiking, running, biking, sailing, knitting, crocheting, sewing, and spending time with her family and her dogs. So I would like to welcome Linda or Dr. Wachs today. I'm sorry, Faye. I'd like to welcome Faye to my show today because, as I said, this is a very exciting topic for me, and I'm really excited about the research that she's doing. So, Linda, welcome, and let's just jump right into this and tell us a bit about yourself, about your upbringing, about your chosen field of study, how you got there, what you're doing, where you're working, your published work, all that kind of stuff. Just give us a rundown.
Well, I really am very much a product of my environment. My father was a professor of city and regional planning, and my mother is a gerontologist. So I sort of grew up in a academic, research-based household, and I was always sort of taught to have this very inquisitive, critical attitude towards everything I saw, to never take things at face value, but to always sort of look deeper into social phenomenon and things that are happening. I grew up right here in Los Angeles. I'm one of the few academics who ended up working right where they're from. I applied for jobs all over the world. I did my undergraduate at the University of California at Berkeley and my graduate work at the University of Southern California. And I've taught at the University of North Florida, at UC Berkeley, at several of the Cal states. Body Panic was the book I wrote with Dr. Sherry Dworkin, who's now the Associate Dean at UCSF, and that looked at basically fitness magazines and gender and how gender was constructed through movement. I've also published on things like sexuality. I actually just finished a paper I'm about to send out on media and electoral politics, so very timely right now. But my real sort of where my heart is with sociology has always been related to sociology of the body and studies that relate to embodiment. I've been at Cal Poly Pomona since 2002. I'm now a full professor. It's a great place to be, and they have been incredibly supportive of my research and my work and the backing. I want to just thank the university for the backing they've given me for this work, and also the Facial Paralysis Institute has been incredibly supportive of my research as well.
That's really great. Now you mentioned that your specialty is embodiment. Could you explain a little bit more about what exactly that means?
Well, in sociology, one of the great things I should add about sociology is you really can study just about anything as long as you study it like a sociologist. But when I first started studying gender and sport and fitness, the body was weirdly absent. That people would talk about gender as if it wasn't an embodied phenomenon, or they would talk about sports, but they would sort of not ever talk about the embodied aspects of it, which is sort of hard to do. And so there was a small group of scholars, a growing group, that started saying we need to be looking at this from an embodied perspective. And there's a big research implication for that too, because what goes along with this is that the researcher is also an embodied subject. So sociologists who look at embodiment want people to understand that the researcher is coming from an embodied standpoint as well as the subject. And you always have to consider how your body looks, how your body feels, how people react to your body. All of those things have shaped the social world. They've shaped how people look at you, how people treat you, the assumptions that are made about you, and all those things really shape your existence. So sociologists who focus on embodiment take that into account when they're doing their study, and they don't discount it. In feminism, the catchphrase, the personal is political, sort of caught on to try to highlight this idea for people. For sociologists of embodiment, we're like, the body's always there, and we always pretend it's not. So I guess that's how I'd explain it. In sociology, it's a lot of high theory. It's very theoretical. But I think most people can relate to the fact that if you're not feeling well, you do your job differently than when you're feeling well. And sort of having to acknowledge that and bring it into research is an important thing. And what we're really starting to see now is people are starting to acknowledge how things like early childhood trauma have a lasting impact on how you physiologically respond to things. Now, I am a sociologist. I'm not a physiologist, but for those of us who study embodiment, we're like, these are our people, and that, yes, right, it's not nature or nurture, it's always both at the same time. And that once those things are ingrained in your body physically, people want to say, oh, well, it's not social inequality anymore. It's not a social problem anymore. It's a physical problem. And for us, it's still a social problem. You are moving through the world in a body when this happened to you. And so making it unhappen or not happen for the next generation is something that's a social problem, not a physical one.
Yeah, I have to admit, I mean, I've often thought about with myself, it's like, because I've had my facial difference for my entire life, my partial facial paralysis. And I wonder, well, how much is shaped by my face, my appearance, how people treated me, that sort of thing, and how much of it is just inherent in my personality, the genetics, whatnot. And like you said, I've come to the conclusion that both have played a role in how I live my life and the choices that I make. So I definitely can understand that.
Yeah, and you can't pull them apart, right? We can't say this is genetic and this was experiential at this point in a human being, right? You're a 3D manifestation of these things. You can't separate them.
Right, and like how much does being a woman make a difference versus what would be different if I were a man type of thing. So, and like
Right.
limitations, how we're feeling physically and mentally. I definitely think that that's an important aspect. And in fact, I want to get into that a little bit later because I want to talk about the mental health aspect. But one of the things I want to start with definitely is your experience of facial paralysis.
Yes. So for me, I got Bell's palsy in November of 2009, just before Thanksgiving. And I didn't know what Bell's palsy was. I just sort of woke up feeling a little strange. And I had an earache the night before, so I'd taken some cold medicine, thinking, oh, maybe there's some fluid in my ear. And I was like, gosh, I feel really weird. So I looked at the side effects on the cold medicine and I said, oh, it says numbness, dizziness. Those are all side effects. Well, maybe I'm having some weird adverse reaction. And I went running, and I was working from home that day, fortunately, and sat down and started trying to work. And my eye wasn't blink. You notice pretty quickly when you're sitting at a computer if you suddenly can't blink, right? The light is very... And okay, something's really wrong. So I started Googling, facial paralysis, and immediately Google started flashing at me, "You are having a stroke." I went, having a stroke? Oh my gosh, right? And then I went, wait a second, my mother's a gerontologist. I know the signs of a stroke. The only one I have is paralysis. I don't have any of the other signs. I don't have any confusion. I don't feel lightheaded. I don't feel dizzy. I feel like completely mentally there. And I said, well,
Google doesn't have answers. You can't just.
No. Yeah. So I went to the bookcase and I pulled Foucault's Discipline and Punish off there, which is like high philosophy, high theory, and started reading it. And I went, okay, I can read Foucault still. I'm not having a stroke. And I, well, let me just be sure. I pulled an advanced stat book off and I started reading, about multiple regression equations. And I went, okay, I can understand this too. I'm not having a stroke, but something's really wrong. So my best friend is a medical doctor, and I sent her a picture, and she said, "You have Bell's palsy, go to the ER right now." So I went to the ER, and they gave me the standard antivirals and prednisone, and said, "Oh, you'll be fine. Do a follow-up with your doctor. It goes away." Well, it doesn't 15% of the time. And there are now some signs of when you're going to be in the group that it doesn't go away. There's some, but it's still not absolute. Scare people who have Bell's palsy, right? But they said it's going to go away, and then it didn't. And so then they gave me a TENS unit, which is actually really bad if you have synkinesis. So if anyone out there has Bell's palsy and is given a TENS unit, do not use it because you might have synkinesis. Make sure you don't have synkinesis first. I was developing synkinesis. Synkinesis is what happens when your nerves grow back after the Bell's palsy. Instead of just growing to where they're supposed to go, they grow to too many places. So in that case, you then are now paralyzed, not because you can't move, but because when you try to move one thing, everything moves. So you try to smile, and this part does go up, but this also pulls down. So it looks like your mouth isn't moving, but the muscles are working. It's just that one's pulling up and one's pulling down, and maybe one's pulling to the side. There is nothing that can be done about synkinesis in terms of reversing it or making it go away. There are things you can do to mitigate it. So like I do Botox every 3 months to help mitigate it. And I do want to add, like, a lot of people think, oh, Botox, it's to make it look better. And what I want to point out about synkinesis is it's actually very painful. So you sort of have to imagine that you have, when you get like a Charlie horse or a knot in your muscle because you've done something. Well, with synkinesis, what's happening is that's happening in your face, not because you're actually using the muscles, but because your body has tricked itself into thinking it's using these muscles. So it's tightening up these muscles in your face, and you're getting Charlie horses in your chin and in your cheek, maybe around your eye or wherever you suffer from synkinesis. For me, the primary thing was that my neck, my platysmus muscle, was always super tight. So if you had looked at me before some of the surgeries and the Botox that I've had, it would always look like I was screaming on half my neck. Like everything was just fully engaged. And I didn't really realize how actually painful that was until I had a surgery called selective neurolysis to just turn off that, because you actually don't need all of the platysmus for that much. It's primarily what makes you frown. And so since it was always active, they sort of said, you're going to lose some of your ability to scowl at people, but it's going to make this not be tight all the time. And I said, do it. And when it turned off, I went, oh, wow, I was in a lot of pain. I had just learned to live with it. And the same, I always can tell when my Botox is wearing off, because everyone around me could probably tell, because I'm trying to rub the knots out of my face, which is part of the physical therapy I did. I also did a year and a half of almost 2 years of physical therapy before I tried surgery and Botox. And technically it was occupational therapy. And that was extremely effective for me. It's not for everyone. So there are different ways to treat it. The most common would be the surgeries, Botox, and occupational therapy, but it never goes away. It never, it can get worse and it can diminish throughout the course of your life. It's a very strange thing that's not very well understood. And that was sort of one of the things that really struck me when this happened to me, is I started trying to research this, like, well, what are the causes? And no one really knows. Like, there's lots of theories about what causes Bell's palsy. No one really knows what causes synkinesis. There's some theories that the TENS units make it worse. But then there's plenty of people who never use the TENS units who get it. There's some theories that if you do electrical impulse stimulation with acupuncture, that makes it worse. But that they still don't think that's the cause. They think it just exacerbates it. So we don't know a whole lot about it, but I guess because it's not fatal, and it's just something you learn to live with, there hasn't been a lot of medical research about it up until now.
Well, I think part of that probably has something to do with, you have to get somebody who is famous enough or rich enough to have it happen to them so that they will invest all kinds of money or draw all kinds of attention to it.
Right. I think the OT, I think she explained it. I love her analogy. So this will really help people understand. She said, what's happening to you with synkinesis, she said, imagine that your arm was temporarily paralyzed. And at some point you became able to move your arm again, but every time you lifted your arm, your leg also lifted. That's kind of what's going on with synkinesis, except it's all facial muscles. Yeah. So like a lot of people, yeah, mouth, eye is a big one. So people will try to smile and their eye will shut.
Yeah, that was one of my questions. I mean, I just have ordinary run-of-the-mill facial paralysis where the nerves and the muscles and whatnot were removed. And so I'll move on one side of my face. I have had reconstruction that has allowed some movement, but I do not have synkinesis. So that was definitely a question I had. And people ask me sometimes, does it hurt? Are you in pain? And my answer is no, thankfully. But it sounds like some people who have like what you have, the synkinesis, it is very painful.
You know what's funny is so many of the participants that I interviewed, and myself included, like, we didn't realize how much pain we were in until we started doing the Botox and the surgery, and it went away. Because when you get synkinesis, it hurts a lot at first. And for me, the way and it was funny because when I was telling my doctor this, they kept saying, oh no, that doesn't happen. I'm like, but it's happening to me, and I'm sure it is. And like, I would literally be sitting still and it would feel like my head went bam, 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 bam. But I'd be sitting completely still and I would like literally feel like, what's going on here? It was, but then you get sort of used to it. And it's only when you go get the Botox, you're like, oh yeah, my chin really hurt before. Oh yeah. So many of the people I interviewed would say, oh yes, I experienced some discomfort. And then they would go on and they would talk about it. And I'm like, you're talking about pain, not discomfort.
It is interesting when other people tell you how you're supposed to be feeling.
Yeah.
Either, this should hurt, or, oh, this shouldn't be happening. I'm like, excuse me, don't you think I would know?
Yeah, but it is. But it is.
So with that, let's talk about, you mentioned about the people that you interview. Mm-hmm. Talk about the research that you're doing.
Well, I focus primarily on the social and the professional impacts of facial paralysis. How did it impact their career? How did it impact their social lives? And a lot of the things that I find are really very typical of social science. So first of all, the more stable a home you come from, the more safe your environment was, the more supportive your environment was, the more you felt valued in your home, the better you handled this, the better the person handled this. And that was just across the board. People who came from unsafe homes, people who came from homes where there was violence or emotional abuse, or, and it was interesting because sometimes they would say it very obliquely. They would say something like, well, my father was very difficult when he was around, right? And you would sort of have to probe them a little, like, what do you mean by difficult? And it would sort of be like, oh, he drank heavily and beat my mother. Okay, yes, that's difficult. People who were, the more difficult an environment you came from, the harder it was to cope with the facial paralysis. So people who, like for me, my parents are wonderful people. I did not grow up in an unsafe environment. I did not grow up in an abusive environment. And I also grew up in an environment with parents who were extremely social justice oriented and very aware of the discrimination against the disabled and the elderly. So I actually grew up in an environment where it was made very clear to me that you do not discriminate against disabled people, that people with any disability have exactly the same rights of everyone else. And not only that, that's not enough, that when we talk about things, we shouldn't even call them accommodations, that making it, my father's a transit planner. And so one of the things he's worked on is making transit accessible for everyone, because people with disabilities are often transit dependent. So I was sort of raised in this environment that gave me a lot of strength and tools to deal with something like this happening to me. The people who came from unsafe environments had the hardest time leaving their house after this happened. And when I say leaving their house, I mean some of them switched to careers where they could work from home because they literally were not going to leave their house. Or they moved to rural communities, or they were already in a rural community and they moved even further out so that they would have very limited interaction, and their interaction would only be with people with whom they already felt safe. And that was very clear to me. People who are invested in their career, like me, people who had a strong investment in their career, who, I don't want to say, oh, successful, right? But who were reasonably successful in their career, or were happy with the success they were having in their career. Like, I don't want to define success externally, but from an internal perspective, if you were satisfied with your career, you were satisfied with where you were, you were satisfied with where it was going, those people coped much better. Because they could say, well, this is awful, but I can still do my job. I still have value in the world. I still have a lot to give. I still have a reason to get out the door, right? A lot of us just getting that reason to go do something. People who, let's see, so the career was a big, people who had children. That was often really an important thing for them getting out the door. There were quite a few people who maybe they didn't have the career, maybe their home life hadn't been as high quality as other people's, but if they were working really hard to give that quality home life, they recognized, I have to get back on track for the sake of my family. Those people got back on track faster. But if you were coming from an unsafe home environment, you didn't have a good social support system, and it could be a family you chose rather than a birth family, right? It's either one, a family you chose or a birth family. If you didn't have strong support there, and if you didn't have a career in which you were really invested, those people had they had an even super hard time getting out the door after this, and really hard time going in public, really hard time meeting people, and even people who had a reasonably success. A couple of people I talked to had to change jobs, not necessarily because of the facial paralysis, but they were moving or for a spouse or whatever reason. The people who had to go out on job interviews, who when they didn't have facial paralysis when they'd initially gotten a job, and now they had facial paralysis, they had a tough time doing that. But if they had the career they cared about, if they had the family support, if they had the good upbringing, they were still able to do it. One story that really sticks with me is there's one who I've gotten to know also through some volunteer work I'm now doing with the organizations. And I also did interview some family members and partners as well as part of the project to get context on this. What really stands out is this young person, she is smart. She's, even with the facial paralysis, she is what you would call conventionally attractive. And she was offered a promotion at work. And for most of us, being offered a promotion at work should be a wonderful, happy thing. And for her, it sent her into a depression and anxiety tailspin, because she was going to have to move from the back office to the front office and deal directly with clients. And she was devastated. I mean, she was excited she'd gotten the promotion, but she said, like, she's like, I should have been, hey, let's go out and celebrate. And she's like, I went home and cried for hours because I was terrified about having to sit having to like And it was even in a medical practice, having to, get people at the medical practice and take them where they needed to go. She said, I was just convinced that every person would be like, well, what happened to you? What happened to your face? And I just remember thinking, that was just such a poignant story for me, that here is this person she was young when this happened, who is making great strides in getting ahead with her career. And for most of us, who didn't, or someone who doesn't have facial paralysis, I'm going to go out, I'm going to celebrate. And she went home and cried.
Well, and actually, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh my gosh, her workplace. What an amazing, incredible workplace to offer her this promotion, knowing that she was going to be in a more interactive role with clients and not carried.
Yeah.
I mean, there are places that would say, we can't have you in the front office because we don't want people to see you. And so that just speaks volumes about the place that she works.
Yes. Yeah. And also she's an amazing person. I'm sure she's been doing a great job for them too. But I did have talked to quite a few people who are told this job anymore because it's going to be off-putting for people to see you, or they got moved someplace where it's interesting. The higher you are career-wise, so somebody like with my kind of job that requires a PhD, their workplaces were far more accommodating and far more willing to work with them, and in many cases give them extra time off for medical recovery issues or for anything they needed. The lower you are in the class status, the worse you were treated by your job as a general rule. Not always. There were some people who had, low-end jobs who worked at a wonderful place and were still treated well. But overall, the lower you are in the class status, the more problematic you were seen as having facial paralysis for your job. And in many ways, what's sort of odd about that is, in many ways, right, those of us who came from the higher class status positions actually have the more FaceTime jobs, right? I mean, I lecture for a living and talk for a living, and this was no problem for my job. Whereas I talked to someone else who, she just, had to like check people in and send them somewhere else. And they're like, oh, no, you can't sit at the front desk anymore. Like low-level administrative assistant, like, no, your eye blinking is going to upset people. No, you're going to be doing filing from now on. Right. And that was sort of an interesting, and as a general rule, class matters so much in the medical care you get. It really was, the richer people were, and once you have health insurance, once you're over a certain income level, it was sort of, everyone was the same. But the poorer you were, the worse your medical care was, and shockingly worse. Where I talked to people who had synkinesis and didn't know what synkinesis was, and they'd been seeing doctors all along and saying, this weird stuff's happening. I feel like things are pulling here. When I eat, my eye waters, like classic synkinesis symptoms. But if they were in a small or a rural or a poor community, chances are they didn't even know they had synkinesis. I'm not a doctor, but
part of it I actually did an interview a while ago with somebody about birthmarks. The name is escaping me, and I'm embarrassed because I should know this. But a lot of doctors don't know the difference between one kind or another kind. The adenomas versus this other stuff, the port lines, they have no clue. And I think that's probably what's happening is, doctors are, as much as they hate to admit it, human. And they have limits in how much knowledge they can possibly, versus wherever their line of study is or what their experiences are. So it makes me wonder if that's just simply a matter of just unawareness on the part of the doctors to even be able to diagnose it.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a part of it. Like when you're in a big urban area, doctors can consult much more easily. And my husband is a doctor. My partner is a doctor. And I certainly, absolutely. You can't know everything about everything, right? That's why there are subspecialties in medicine. But there was also a second piece to it, which is they were taken less seriously. Like when I kept going, they also had fewer resources to fight with them, right? Well, the first 3 times I went back to my medical provider and said, it's not going away and something else is going on, they were like, you're fine, go away. But I'm a professional. I'm used to having to go and, I hate to say I work at a university, I'm used to having to go and fight for the stuff I want or write 10,000 memos to get whatever I need. And so I had the resiliency to keep going back and saying, no, you're wrong. Something's going on here. And so I think the part of it is also when people of a lower class status tried to do that, they were shut down a lot quicker than someone like me who's coming in with a medical professional with me who's able to say all the right medical terms. And he's a radiologist, so he went to neurologists and said, what do we need to say to my medical provider we were getting like the exact lines from neurologists. Most people don't have access to stuff like that. There also were people in very rural areas, right? They've only got access maybe to one doctor. And if that person hasn't heard of it, they often were left with very little medical care. There are also other causes of facial paralysis. And one thing I noticed, and again, I'm not a doctor, but sometimes someone would tell me I was diagnosed with Bell's palsy, then I ended up with synkinesis, and they would run through their whole story. And the symptoms they described to me were Ramsay's-Hunt symptoms, not Bell's palsy symptoms. Now, Ramsay's-Hunt is extremely rare, and I wouldn't have ever heard of it if I hadn't started studying facial paralysis. But it always sort of made me incredibly uncomfortable when a person would be telling me, I've been treated for Bell's palsy, and then they would go on to list the classic symptoms of Ramsay's-Hunt. And like, what am I supposed to say? And I would generally at the end of the interview say, oh, by the way, you might want to for Ramsay's-Hunt too. It's very similar to Bell's palsy, but slightly different. And they would always say, what's Ramsay's-Hunt? I've never heard of this. It is very rare. I don't expect most doctors to have heard of it. But if you're in like a place like I am, Los Angeles, and it's not, something's wrong, right? My doctor was able to call another doctor and call another doctor and call another doctor. And I was able to go places. And when I started looking into the specialists in this, right, one of the world-renowned specialists in it is 5 miles from my house. That's a lot different than the woman I talked to in rural Kentucky, right, where the nearest specialist is in Boston and she's a telemarketer. So she can't afford to go to Boston and see a specialist. She's a telemarketer, single mom with no car. How is she going to get to Boston to see a specialist?
Okay, I have some people are commenting. I'm pleased to say that we do have some live attendees on our conference here. So I wanted to, first of all, say thank you for those of you who are watching, whether it's live or after the fact. We appreciate that you're here, and we appreciate your questions. And I'm going to go ahead and convey a few of those so that Dr. Wachs can address those. The other thing I want to say is I know that we're kind of fading in and out a few times. So hopefully everything is clear. I know that it's intermittent, and I believe for the most part you're getting the majority of the message. But if there's anything you need repeated because we dropped out for a second, by all means, please let us know. So Kelly wanted to point out that she actually has Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. She also, I'm not quite, you might want to clarify this for me, Kelly. You have a comment that says, looks prior to paralysis affecting recovery. That's not exactly it.
I think I understand what she's asking. I think she's asking is how good looking how good looking the person perceived themselves to be. Did that impact their recovery? Is that what she's asking?
It could be. That's all she said is looks prior to paralysis affecting recovery.
I think I definitely, it was very interesting because, yes, yes and no. Like, so definitely the people who were the most upset about having synkinesis or the most frustrated by having synkinesis were women, for starters, which is definitely looks related, right? Women, men also have pressure to look a certain way, but women definitely have a lot of pressure to look a certain way. And so women who, how did a lot of them put it? Middle-aged women who were pretty good looking before had a really hard time with, myself included, had a really hard time with this because you're already dealing with the loss of attractiveness that comes with aging. That's normal. And then all of a sudden this happened and it was like, people really react to you differently. And you know, and that sort of different reaction was very damaging to their self-esteem, because they recognized, oh yeah, I'm already getting older. I know I'm not that hot young thing anymore who can get the free meals or get out of the speeding ticket. But, you know, and they were adjusting to that, and then all of a sudden they had to adjust to people sort of giving them that look, you know, like that, oh, what's wrong with, like, and that's what a lot of people talked about, is avoiding social situations. Not because people said anything to them, not even because people even necessarily treated them differently, but it was just in conversation, they said, and I know this too, they would always sort of get that look where you can tell that the person is thinking, there's something not right with that person's face. I wonder what it is. Is it physical? Is it cognitive? Okay, it's not cognitive. It just appears to be physical. I wonder what happened to them. I wonder if they were in an accident, right? And you know that dialogue is going on in their head. And you have to sort of keep plowing along resiliently with your own end of that conversation and pretending that that's not what's going on in their head, even though you see it written clearly on their face. And so for attractive women, yeah, they were getting a super different response than they were getting before, and they just didn't want to have to deal with it. So a lot, what I tended to see people doing, and this was everyone, not just the women, is they only wanted to associate with people who they already knew and who had already adjusted to the way they look, so they didn't have to see that reaction in other people. The dating was really tough for single women. Single women, once this happened, it was like, oh, it's hard enough being an older woman trying to date, and now I'm an older woman with a messed up face trying to date, right? It was really hard for people. But then for other people, it was really interesting. If you had the strong family background, if you came from a family that had made it really clear to you that looks were not the most important thing, those people did much better. I've had quite a few subjects who grew up in families, or participants, I should say, who grew up in families where they were told that looks were very important. And they got this message continually. And for these people, and especially the women, this was far more devastating, because, and many of them were literally told by their families, oh gosh, you know, like almost like you let the family down. We used to have such an attractive family, right? And doesn't put up pictures of her. So she goes to her mom's house and there's pictures of all her brothers and sisters, and there's no pictures of her. And she asked her mom about it, and her mom said, oh, well, now that your face is messed up, I figured you wouldn't, I mean, we don't want that picture up there. And she was like, I'm still your kid, right? Like, I'm still your kid. Like, what? And she's like, she's like, I was already dealing with that internally. Like, oh, I look so horrible. No one should have to look at me. To have my mom say, I'm not going to put up your picture because of how you look. She's like, I wanted to crawl. She told me I wanted to crawl in a hole and die. She's like, but I can't.
I want to talk to parents. That is one of my goals, is to talk to parents, because I tell you, growing up, I mean, I had surgery, but it was kind of the expectation that I would continue to have surgery so that I could look as good as possible. However, I never had the feeling that I had to be pretty. I mean, I think they just did it because they felt that that was best for me. And I mean, my parents never hid me away. There's lots of pictures. That is the one thing that I am most grateful to my parents for, is that they took me everywhere. Disney World, parks, we traveled across country, and I never got the feeling that they were embarrassed by me.
Yeah.
In fact, if anything, they were defensive of me. So, which had its own ramifications, because it taught me to be defensive. But
Yeah.
and I think parents need to model the behavior that they want their children to have. But that's kind of a different topic. I do want to jump over, because we do have a question from who is asking, what prompted you to inquire about safe versus unsafe environment as a major factor in determining adjustment to facial paralysis?
You know, I'm a social scientist, and I was doing what I call semi-structured interviews. So I had a set of questions I would ask everybody, and then prompts that I would ask based on their unique stories. And so I didn't actually initially ask about safe versus unsafe. I would just ask about their childhood. And then afterwards, it became very clear that there was this big difference between the safe and the unsafe. And the reason I asked about their childhood and their parents and their family was because I thought that I knew from other studies and from other types of issues that family background had played an enormous role in people's self-confidence and their sense of self-worth. So I just was sort of assuming that when you were dealing with something like facial paralysis, family background would matter as well. And so I just sort of asked these very general questions about family background and would, based on their responses, sort of probe in to try to figure out what their background. Saying about parents, I wanted to add is I interviewed this one young person who got Bell's palsy in middle school, right? Like the worst possible time to get facial paralysis when you're already being teased. And she was, I wanted to go hug her parents after talking to her, because she was so brave and so just like, this happened to me and it is not going to stop me. And it was very, very clear that was coming from her parents, that her parents had raised her before any of this had happened as like, everybody has issues, everybody's got problems, but none of us are going to let them stand in our way. And I thought she was amazing, because I said, well, how do you wonder what the things she did to cope with it? And she said, I started wearing the most outrageous, crazy, bright outfits I could wear. And she said, the advice everyone gave me was, don't call attention to yourself. You don't want anyone to notice your face. And she said, before this, I always wanted to dress kind of crazy, but I always felt a little inhibited. I didn't want to stand out. And then she said, after this, I was like, what the hell? I stand out now anyway. Might as well wear bright orange boots and a funky pink top and just embrace it. And she was just one of the best adjusted people I'd ever met. And I was like, it really was coming from this family that was so supportive of her.
Yeah, well, I tell you, I mean, maybe it's because I'm actually turning 50 this month and I've lived this all my life, but you were talking about how people become so self-conscious about people looking at them and whatnot. Well, I mean, I just don't even think about it most of the time. I actually volunteer to sell merchandise for bands at concerts. And we're talking hundreds of people that parade up to the merch booth.
Right.
Only ever been like maybe once or twice, because my husband and I volunteer together, that maybe they'll go to him instead of coming to me. And then I just say, hey, can I help you? Because I'm standing there doing nothing.
Right.
And thankfully, the bands don't have any bias. They've never say, oh, no, we can't have you. The bands have been awesome. And I mean, if the customers, the fans notice, they're very good at hiding it, because I just don't allow it to be a factor. And I've put myself out there very publicly. I'm a professional speaker. I've written books. And it just is, I mean, that's my choice, is to be out in the world and be a role model for people who have a difference. Mm-hmm. Because I want people to understand, hey, it's okay to get out there and live your life and not be afraid of what other people think.
Well, and I think even a lot of the people who've had negative experiences, now some of the negative, like one interesting gender difference I did notice was that older men, and this is not happening as much to the younger generation, but many of the older men I spoke to who've had facial paralysis for a long time were actually victimized violently. Like they were actually physically attacked, usually by a person who was not sober at the time. But the women, I didn't talk to any women who were physically attacked because of their facial paralysis on the street. But and I had men just because it's harder to get the men to talk in the first place. But I was sort of surprised at the number of older men who you know, they each had at least one story of someone just sort of walking up to them and trying to start a fight with them because of their facial paralysis, which was sort of shocking, you know, to hear and disturbing to hear from them as well. But that was definitely something that stood out to me as something that was happening to men that wasn't happening to women. But another piece of that I've also tried to get people to understand, and obviously not when I'm doing interviews, is sometimes when someone comes up to them and says something strange, the person that came up to them and said something about their face has a disability too. Right? Because I've had this happen to me where someone has said something to me about like my smile or whatever. And as I'm talking to the person, it's very clear to me that maybe they're on the spectrum, or maybe they have a cognitive disability of some kind. And so I always like to remind people that when someone says something to you on the street that seems out of line or strange or unusual, they may have a hidden disability that removed their filter or whatever. And so I try to treat them with compassion too, right? Instead of, well, you're a horrible person, why would you ask me about my face, right? Is try to see them with compassion, right? It's, if they're not being hostile, if they're just being genuine, I try to be genuine back and assume that there's no malice and there's no harm and there's no malintent there.
Yeah, a lot of time it's just a matter of how they ask and the context. I mean, there's obvious when people are just plain being rude, but I mean, especially kids, I mean, they're just curious. And I engage. I mean, whereas before I used to get more defensive, now I engage. I will actually invite kids especially, if you have a question, go ahead and ask me. It's okay. I don't mind. Because I'd rather diffuse that curiosity. I'd rather let them know that I'm not something to be afraid of, or that I'm not something strange and weird and different, even though sometimes I am. But I prefer to educate than to be, I don't want to be a guy, when it's just go away, it's none of your business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like I'm a very visual person. I'm more visual than other people. I probably, if somebody comes up to me and there's something stuck to their face, I probably will notice, right? And I always think to myself, you notice things about other people all the time, and then you just go on with the conversation. And you don't worry about it, and you don't think about it. So I just remind myself, that's what other people are doing too. They're just noticing something and going on with the conversation.
Well, and I mean, if somebody has spinach in their teeth, I will probably tell them, because they can do something about it, and it's embarrassing. So I also feel that, we almost, those of us who have differences, I think we have a little more license to talk to each other and ask questions. I think people that are, quote, normal probably are a little less comfortable in doing that.
Yeah, though I try to remind myself, nobody's normal. We all have our things, just some of them are more visible than others. Right. None of us are normal. That's what I always tell myself. That person over there that looks like their life is perfect and they look like everything is perfect, who knows what's going on inside them?
Well, I have Karen, one of our viewers, she kind of put together a little story in her comments. She says, I have salivary gland cancer with facial paralysis. And then she goes on to say, for me, I am a nurse and I had a prominent job as a clinical consultant with presentations. I was single with a strong family background. I lost my job because I had to be on disability and I was devastated. And she finishes with, it is important to be accepted for who you are. And boy, I sure can't agree with that enough.
Well, one of the things I would really like to see come out of this research is extending the same disability protections to people with facial paralysis. Many people with facial paralysis aren't even aware that they can go on disability during their recovery period, or that they might, depending on what their job is, be eligible for disability. In addition, the reconstructive surgery for a lot of people isn't covered by their health insurance, which I interviewed a person who was a breast cancer survivor, and she was completely, I thought she had the best analogy of anyone I've talked to. And she said, after I had a mastectomy, they told me, we have to rebuild your breast because it would be too devastating for your self-esteem if we didn't offer you breast reconstruction surgery. And she was like, yeah, it was nice that they gave me this new breast, right? She's like, but let me be 100% clear. This is way more damaging to my self-esteem, and they won't even cover Botox for me. And so I think that another thing is getting the different things for people with facial paralysis covered. So when I first got facial paralysis, the Botox wasn't covered by my healthcare provider. It is now. And literally when they started covering it, the guy who does it got booked up completely within like a month. And he had to now train a physician assistant to do more Botox, and they're both now completely booked all the time. And it's real and it's medical. And for the reconstruction, right, the selective neurolysis, I paid for that out of pocket. And it was an expensive surgery. And I know when I talk to people about it, everyone focuses on how much better my face looks since I did that. Because before, like, my whole face was just getting pulled down this way. So my whole face was just down here. As much as I'm pleased with the results from an appearance standpoint, because he did a great job. I'm like, wow, I look almost like I did before. He did a great job on that. The reduction of the pain was the big game changer for my life, right? For me being able to focus on my job. Like, you don't realize how much pain affects your concentration until it goes away. And I was like, or your mood, right? So this is one of the big things I'm looking at theoretically is when your face is mimicking stress, even if you're not under stress, your mind thinks you're stressed because your facial muscles are doing stress. You know, they always tell you smile and it'll make you happier. Well, that's true. But it's also true that if your face is pulled into an expression of stress, you will feel stressed even if you're not actually stressed. So one of the big things I noticed was when I got this turned off, this weird stress feeling that I had all the time was gone because it was physiological. It was a physiological response. And I went, oh, wow. So getting health providers to understand that treating synkinesis, it's not just about the way we look. It's not just about our self-esteem, which are important things too. If it's important to rebuild someone's breast to fix their self-esteem, it's certainly important to help them with their face. But it's not just that. It's pain, it's discomfort, it's all these other things that are problematic. In addition, for some people, the rewiring can be really problematic. So for the vision reason, some people, their tear ducts get rewired to their salivary glands. So they're not producing tears correctly. That can actually lead to you going blind in that eye. That's a very serious medical condition that requires treatment. For me, I got really lucky. I didn't get that cross wiring, but whenever I get a cold, I know that I'm getting a cold because there's something somehow in how I got cross wired that whenever I'm getting a cold and my nose is going to start running, my eye just tears uncontrollably and I look like a James Bond villain. That was actually something else that people pointed out, is how often facial difference is used to signify evil in popular culture. And so a lot of people have also pointed out we would really be great if facial difference wasn't so ubiquitously used to indicate evil person. Because, you know, what message does that send those of us with facial difference?
Yeah, exactly. And I think part of that is, yeah, I know that Wonder, if you haven't heard of that, Wonder is now being made into a movie. But also the idea, I think what happens is when you have a facial difference, when you've had something traumatic happen to you, they think, oh, you're angry and bitter. And that's just not always true. So we have to, yeah, because a lot of us get by just fine.
Well, and it's sort of funny because people with facial paralysis, it's often assumed you're angry and bitter because you don't smile. Well, you can't, right? So many people told me that you know, it's already bad enough as a one. Oh, why don't you smile, honey? How come you don't smile, right? You're already getting that. So on top of that, to then to literally not be able to smile and have people assume that you're mean. I mean, I've been told by people that we just assumed that you were a very inexpressive person. And I'm like, I used to be a super expressive person. I just can't make those expressions anymore. And what I just wanted to add, one of the big things that's coming out now, and this is not my research, but other people I've working with, and I want to incorporate it into my work, is when we talk to people, we tend to mimic their facial expressions. So when someone's telling you a story, you'll subconsciously start to mimic their facial expressions. And this is a back and forth. That's part of normal communication. You don't realize you're doing it. You know, like, I mean, it's not like the person's like, ah, and you're ah, right? It's very subtle things, like the tightening of the eyes or a little pull at the corner of the mouth. We will mimic back and forth to each other. And because people with facial paralysis can't do that, the person they're talking to starts to feel uncomfortable. For no other reason than we're just hardwired to communicate in this way. And so what happens with people with facial paralysis is people start associating them with an uncomfortable feeling. Oh, whenever I talk to that person, I feel weird. Whenever I talk to them, I feel uncomfortable. So having facial paralysis is unbelievably isolating because you already yourself have this like, oh, it's so hard to get out of the house. I feel so isolated. And then you get this response from people that they're clearly uncomfortable talking to you, and they're clearly disconcerted, and they're clearly, you know, unsettled, that makes you want to withdraw. And so what you tend to see with people with acquired facial paralysis, and also with congenital, but to a lesser degree, but with acquired, they withdraw. Like the congenital people have withdrawn already, but the acquired people withdraw very much so from things they used to do. I think not across the board, but the majority withdrew, at least temporarily, because they were getting these this weird interface. And how people coped, I know you mentioned coping, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to mention the coping strategies too, is one thing I noticed was that people figured out how to cope in all these creative ways with that. So one woman I interviewed was an engineer, and she was just the facts, man, total engineer in every way, shape, and form. And I work with our engineering department a lot. And I thought it was so great that her approach was so pragmatic, is that when she would go out and she would get strange responses, she just got a friend to come with her for a week and say, what does my face look like when I'm doing this? What's happening when I'm doing this? And then her friend would tell her. And so then she would adjust the way she communicated with people until she got the right response. So she would like to run, and she would always smile at people when she ran. And now when she would smile at people, her friend was like, no, it looks like you're grimacing in pain because you're running. So they're not even getting that you're smiling at them. Because she was like, how come nobody smiles at me anymore? And so she learned, like, okay, and so she learned not to smile at all because it would look like she was in pain, but instead give like a friendly wave. And then people would smile at her, right? Total, like, that's an engineer, right? I'm going to troubleshoot the problem. I'm going to create a solution. I'm going to test my solution. Great, my solution worked. And I thought people tended to figure out their coping strategies that best matched, you know, what their personality was, if they were able to develop the coping strategies. One other last coping strategy I'll mention is, because I love dogs, so many people mentioned getting a dog or their dog being super, and so a few mentioned cats too. Cats were important too. I don't want to get hate mail from the cat people. The cats are great too. But so many people mentioned the dog as giving them the courage to go out and talk to people because their dog loved them no matter what.
Yeah, animals. I have horses, I have cats, and I have dogs. And I mean, they just respond differently. They respond to your body language. They respond to your mood, your tone of voice. So you're right. It's not just about unconditional love, but it's about a genuine response.
Yeah.
So, and that's interesting because we have Karen who mentions that her inability to do facial expressions. She was one of the people that withdrew. And so I think it's really great that you are able to present solutions for people who might be frustrated by that. So there are things that they can try, things they can do. I actually have another webinar with somebody who has Mobius, and he just has to use tone of voice and body expressions instead of his face. I guess you just make me feel very fortunate that I at least have half a face, so that if at least somebody knows that I'm smiling. So that's so it's weird how you can be reminded how lucky you are, even when you have something that seems to be a disadvantage. Before we, and yeah, by all means, I'll give you time to comment, but I did want to talk about if people want to get involved in your study, what do they need to do?
All they need to do is email me at flwachs@cpp.edu. And even though I'm starting to wrap up the interviews now, I'd like to do a few more, but I'm also working with Kathleen Bogard, who has Mobius syndrome, and we are going to put together a grant to do some future studies on support groups for facial paralysis. And so we still are going to need lots of people in those studies. We're working with the Facial Paralysis Institute. We're looking for some funding. We've been doing online to reach the most people and what is the best way to provide the right kind of care. Another thing that I'm really passionate about is getting the mental health counseling as part of the treatment plan for anyone with facial paralysis. Because I think that I 100% had a negative mental health outcome. I mean, not permanent, but a negative mental health experience as a result of facial paralysis. And like less than 3% of the people I talked to, it was suggested to them immediately that mental health counseling might be a good thing. Having people that special, and also it can't just be any mental health counseling, it should be someone who specializes in these kinds of problems and these kinds of transitions. Interestingly, I've often found like people who specialize in things like eating disorders are sometimes good at this. Things who specialize in body related things are often good therapists to see for this, but it should be standard.
Yeah, it's amazing that, I mean, the medical profession seems to want to focus on the physical, and they kind of forget about the mental, because you had talked earlier about how your Botox and whatnot helped you physically. I'm kind of the same way. I'm actually not a huge advocate for surgery as a fix to physical appearance. I am, however, definitely in favor of it when it reduces pain or improves quality of life in some way. I believe that it's possible for people to adjust to appearance.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why, well, I guess what it is I've seen so many and experienced so many surgeries that have gone wrong.
Yeah.
That unless it was fixing something that was a real issue, like you were having trouble eating and so you needed something done, you know, or you had apnea and you needed your jaw moved forward or stuff like that, definitely by all means surgery. But if like, you know, well, my nose is horrible. I just had surgery on my eye last March, and about the only thing it did do was kind of make it look better, but that wasn't the idea. The
Right.
idea help my eye maybe close better so it wouldn't water as much, and that just didn't work out very well. So
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of like, I also had my nose redone because I turned out I had a deviated septum, and with the facial paralysis and the additional changes to my face, I really couldn't breathe. And so that my healthcare provider did do for me, because like, it was funny. I went in and they looked and they said, "Oh, wow, you really can't breathe." And that, like, honestly, that was like a miracle for me. Like, to be able to breathe through my nose again is literally, I can't describe to people. I literally thought when I would watch movies and they would put tape over someone's mouth, I would be like, you would die if that happened. If someone put tape over my mouth, I'd be dead. And now I can breathe. And I'm like, it's a miracle.
yeah, I can breathe out of one nostril, but I will say I had one of those incredible Italian Roman noses. And during one of my surgeries, my doctor decided that they could probably take care of that while in the process of doing something else. So that was my one cosmetic indulgence when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
Did it have to be done? Well, we found a way to justify it.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where if changing your physical appearance really will help your mental state, hey, great. You know, but I really but a lot of people took a lot of flack. I've talked to quite a few people where they were taking flack for their Botox, where their relatives were like, "You're just doing that to try to look younger." And they're like, "No, I'm doing it to try to not be in pain and to eat more effectively and to, swallow more effectively." And they would, they would really get negative responses from people. And that's unfortunate. I think that we should all try to be a little more compassionate to those around us.
So what are your plans for the study? What are the results?
I presented I did my first presentation at a conference in March. That was a little more of an academic conference for my field. And I'm working on I've started the first paper based on the research, which is primarily also an academic piece on the methodology side of it. But the long-term goal is a book, which I've also just started. I'm looking for a publisher. A book that would sort of be both academic and accessible to what academics call a lay audience, or so that anyone could read it, but that it would, the way I usually do books like this is I do one chapter that's kind of the heavy academic stuff, and then I tell anyone who's not an academic, just skip that chapter and read the rest of the book. So that's sort of what I'm shooting for. I'm going to have one chapter that's really going to be the theory side of it, and the rest of it's going to be like the coping strategies, the adjustments, the communication-related issues, things like that. And then I'm also working with Kathleen Bogart and Amanda Hemich on some work on Mobius. We went to the Mobius Foundation conference and we talked about to parents and siblings about coping strategies as well, and getting better mental health outcomes for people with facial paralysis.
Yeah, I know. I was just watching the webcast. I have it on another computer, and I know that things kind of just faded out. So I'm not sure because I think there's about a 30-second delay. So hopefully people stuck with us. So basically, what you just said is that you're working on a book, and you're going to have some of it's going to be academic and some of it's going to be practical. I'm actually going to take that opportunity to say that I've written a book
Mhm.
called Facial Shift: Adjusting to an Altered Appearance. And I know that I've had some pretty incredible feedback from people who have acquired facial difference. And again, I come from the point of view of someone who's lived this way all my life. So I really worked to try to understand what it would be like for someone who experienced a change after childhood, for example. And I've had people who have said, man, I wish I'd had this book when I was younger, or so I think I was successful. I'm very, very proud of that, very pleased that I have written something that has been helpful to people. So if people want to look that up, by all means, it's for me, it's about getting that out there and helping people live a better life. And I believe that they is on the same page for that.
Yeah, and a lot of people told me, well, maybe all this is just in my head. Maybe all this is just in my head. And I always like to leave people with that quote from J.K. Rowling, where Albus Dumbledore says, "Just because it's happening inside your head doesn't mean it's not real."
That's very true, and that's where we always have to be respectful. Because I always say, well, oh, that person, she really doesn't, her face is almost completely normal. What is her problem? But you
Mhm.
can't know that because that is their reality.
Mhm.
You can't be comparing yourself because it's all about what's in here. It's not about what you see in the mirror.
Right, right. Yeah, and like most people will tell me, "Oh, I would never know if you didn't tell me." And I'm like, "But my eye feels so tight." Because with synkinesis, it's what you're feeling. I'm like, "But my eye feels so tight all the time." But can't you see my chin is tight right now? Of course they can. Right? Of course they can't. All right. They'll notice if I smile big. If I smile big, it's very obvious. And anyone who knew me before, it's immediately obvious to them because I don't look like I looked before. But yeah, I know I definitely talked to, and that was interesting too, is some people would have very noticeable facial difference and it didn't bother them very much. And other people like me, if you saw them on the street, you probably wouldn't notice until they talk, and you see my mouth is not on center when I talk. You wouldn't notice, and they were devastated by the experience. It's different and everyone's experience is valid.
Absolutely. So I have one final question that I ask all my guests. If you had one action item, someone who isn't feeling so secure about their thing, what is the one thing that you would advise them to do to help them get on a road to maybe feeling better about themselves?
Well, I always advise people, and this is what I do myself. Whenever I am at my lowest, the thing you need to do is volunteer to help other people. Because, and I'm not even saying like the quickest road to feeling better about yourself is altruism. Right. So I started volunteering with homeless youth to help me get through this. And it's been an amazing experience. I mean, if you want to not feel sorry for yourself, hang out with a kid who was thrown out when he was 12 because he's gay and has been living on the streets, surviving as a sex worker for 6 years and is now trying to get into community college. Right. That puts it in perspective for you pretty quickly. Right. I mean, and so like, and also it gets you out. I mean, the hardest thing for people is to get out the door. And so if you can get out the door to do something altruistic, to help other people, you will feel better about yourself because you'll know that even though this happened to you, you still have something to contribute to other people.
Yeah, that's an amazing answer because I don't think any of my guests has mentioned that before. I mean, and that's something that I'm definitely a believer in is getting out there, get yourself out into the world. Um, take, if you're worried about going out by yourself, take someone with you, but get into the world and continue living your life because you know what? Your happiness is important.
Yeah, I got married after my facial. I was getting divorced when I got facial paralysis. Like, who wants to get facial paralysis in the middle of a divorce, right? Probably the stress that's something to do with it. I've gotten married since then. I've got a kid. My kid could care less that my smile's off center.
Well, isn't that because, I mean, that's all your kid has known?
Yeah.
I mean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't care.
I've been 1 years, and like I said, I've been like this all my life.
Yeah.
So my husband, we got together, and he's a great guy, smart, makes a good living. He's an engineer, and I mean, it is possible to find someone who loves you and to have a good, solid relationship, even if you look different.
Yeah. And if everybody's got their issues, everyone, like, how'd my friend put it? She's like, we've all got our baggage. The question is yours carry on, or do you have 3 of those carts behind you that you're pulling along, right?
Right. Well, we need to get wrapped up. I want to thank everyone who jumped on with us. I know that Kelly just brought up a comment about grief, and that's
Yes.
definitely
Yes, plus that will be a chapter in my book. The language of grief was ubiquitous, and it was particularly for the smile. Yeah, I could write an entire paper just on the grief over losing the smile and the self that goes along with the smile.
Yeah, and I actually bring it up in my book as well. I mean, because it's
Yeah.
something loss of any kind, and I don't think they make that connection, but it is,
No.
and you need to allow yourself that.
Yeah, it's mourning. It's just like mourning. You're mourning for your former self.
So, well, any last thoughts? It's been an absolute pleasure. You've just been fascinating, and it's all really important stuff. And I mean, I recommend anyone get a hold of Faye because she's full of information. I mean, I just have life experience, but she actually studies this stuff for
Well,
more than.
yeah. Well, I was going to just
Uh,
mention I've been volunteering with the Facial Paralysis Institute, and they're going to be having a walk in October to raise awareness for people with facial paralysis. Let me just check the date so I can give people the right date. It's going to be in October in Long Beach. If anyone's interested, go to the Facial Paralysis Institute website, and you can get lots of information about it. It's going to be down in beautiful downtown Long Beach, I think October 15th or 16th. It's on their website, and it's a 1 mile walk. It's designed for people it's going to be a very easy walk. It's designed for people who might also have a disability and they can't walk that far because, some people with acoustic neuroma have facial paralysis. And I'd really encourage anyone who's interested to come on out if they can. It's a great experience.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing about just getting out there. And sometimes I have to admit, it's weird to get out with other people that have facial differences.
Yes.
Because I've had to face this alone for so many years. And at first, it's kind of like, how is it going to feel when I look around and everyone has something up with their face? And actually, it feels kind of good. It really
Yeah, it feels great.
People understand. They get it.
Mm-hmm.
But that shouldn't stop you from going out and interacting with other people who don't have facial differences. I mean, they can deal with it. They'll either pretty much ignore it and treat you like a normal human being. I'm a believer that you are treated. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're out in the world and expect that people are going to treat you like anyone else, that's basically how they're going to treat you. If you go out in the world and expect to be stared at and put down, that very likely could happen.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap because we are running a bit over, but like I said, there's no particular time limit. It's more a matter of people's attention spans. So, I just want to say, first of all, I want to say thank you again, Dr. Faye Wachs, sorry, for coming on and talking about this very important topic. Secondly, I wanted to say that my next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, September 14th with photographer Rick why would I do that? Rick Guidotti. And he's a founder of an organization called Positive Exposure. Rick was a fashion photographer, but got to the point in which he was tired of everyone telling him what beauty should look like. And so he discovered beauty in people with physical differences and started photographing them. And it's now like internationally has all these different organizations that photograph people with their own form of beauty. So he's helping to redefine beauty through his work. I also want to say, don't make sure it is very important to be kind to others, but don't forget to be kind to yourself. And with that, like I say, don't forget about my book, Facial Shift. I think you could get a lot out of it. It's available on my website, facinguptoit.com. It's also available at Amazon. And usually I don't push my stuff very much, but I do want to say that I think it's very relevant to this type of audience. So again, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And hopefully you'll tune in again. I also have an archive of 26 other episodes, including some with Mobius, including episodes that deal with birthmarks and whatnot. So it's quite an archive. Some very interesting people with some good stories that I think a lot of you would find helpful.
We are love. We are one. We are how we treat each other when the day is done. We are peace. We are war. We are how we treat each other, nothing more. We are how we treat each other, nothing more. We are how we treat each other.